We're talking today with LeeRoy Stelter of St. Joseph, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Was born on April 7th, 1948 in Coloma, Michigan.
All right. And did you grow up there?
Pretty much. Graduated, actually transferred my senior year from Coloma to St. Joe and graduated high school in St. Joe, Michigan.
Okay. And what was your family doing for a living when you were a kid?
Basically, my father was pretty much a mechanic, a maintenance man, and he was steadily employed at a couple of different places. So,
Okay. All right. And then, so what year did you finish high school?
1966.
Okay. And what did you do after you graduated?
Went to work in a factory, making factory that made record players.
Okay. Back when we still did that. I guess they still make them now. All right. And now, at this time, how aware were you of the Vietnam War?
When I graduated from high school, it was a topic that we talked about amongst ourselves because of the draft had started, and everybody had to register, and it was on the news at night. It's pretty much the extent of the awareness.
Okay. And then how did you wind up in the military?
I had a cousin ask me what I was going to do for a career. At that point in time, I had no idea. I felt that I would continue to work in a factory, and he suggested that I might consider joining the Army as an opportunity to help my career, enlist and get into a program that might be beneficial to me after I left. So I went down, talked to the recruiter, and he showed me this opportunity to become a microwave radio repairman, which is basically AT&T, the military version. We would send basically battalion level communications back and forth between battalions, just as their means of communicating with one another. So I figured that would give me a background in electronics. That's in the late 60s, electronics were coming of age, and I thought that would be an excellent opportunity for me. Besides, it took 7 months of training to become a microwave radio repairman, and I had no idea, what the likelihood was of me ending up in Vietnam until after I'd completed my training.
Yeah, so maybe if you train long enough, the war will be done and I'll go home.
That was a thought.
Oh, well. Okay. So when did you start basic training?
In August of 1967.
Okay. All right. And where did you go for basic training?
Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Okay. I guess to back up a little before that, you had a physical, a draft physical, or did you get it initially, or?
When because I had enlisted,
Okay.
there was a delay because I actually they had to synchronize my time in basic training with when the microwave radio school started. So they started me out a little bit after I was initially enlisted. So I had already accumulated some reserve time. Then I went in, like I say, at the end of August, and that timed my basic training so that when I got out, I was in sync with the microwave radio school.
Okay. I was asking in part about, did you have initially a physical when you first signed up for the draft, or was your first physical after you enlisted?
My first physical was after I enlisted.
Okay. All right. And then where do you go for basic training?
The basic training again was Fort Knox,
Fort Knox,
Kentucky.
Right. Okay. So we're at Fort Knox, and then what did they do when you get there?
Basically issued us our attire, gave us haircuts, assigned us to a company area, and we kind of got introduced to basic military practices.
Okay. And, often showing up for basic training, it gets depicted as a bunch of guys with Smokey Bear hats yelling at you and things. Some of that's from the Marine Corps, but did you get that kind of treatment when you showed up?
Absolutely. My drill sergeant looked like Smokey the Bear. He happened to be a black gentleman, very highly decorated staff sergeant, or actually sergeant first class, I'm sorry. He was a member of the Green Berets, supposedly had a field commission as a major when he was in the field, had been, and he stated this to us when he put his dress uniform on, he had been awarded every medal and or citation that he could have gotten at the time. He was an extremely well qualified individual.
All right. And how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to life in the Army?
Fairly simple. My parents raised me, to follow, do what you're told and keep your mouth shut, and I really didn't find it with much difficulty at all. Although there was an issue, and I don't completely understand exactly what happened, but my training company ended up being very special. There were a lot of different exercises that other people went through that we did not go through. And I didn't completely understand that until we got towards the end of the cycle. But at the time that I went in '67, they were pretty much trying to, if you will, clean out the inner cities. So there were a lot of very rough individuals, if you will, in my company. There were a couple that went AWOL. They served on a detail out picking up trash. A couple of them made a run for it. The guard, of course, yelled, "Halt." They didn't halt. He fired a warning shot. They continued. He leveled on them. And I don't remember whether one or two were killed. So that brought our training company under scrutiny by the Army. We didn't, most other training companies marched or ran to from training activity to training activity. We took buses. There were very few times when we rode. Bivouac. Some people spent 2 or 3 nights out in the bushes. We were out for one night. And then I guess we were under tight surveillance. I didn't realize that they were very concerned that there might be some further AWOLs or what. But so it was a different experience.
Okay. Now, were there tensions or conflicts among the recruits themselves?
Not really. There were just normal things. We had in my platoon, for instance, there were a couple of guys that started mouthing off to each other, and they ended up settling it by like a dance-off. I can dance better than you can. We do it better in Philly than you do in New Jersey. It was interesting, but even though it was quite a diverse group from a large part of the country, they all got along pretty well.
All right. And then I guess the other thing would be the physical training side of things. I mean, was that easy enough for you, or did you have to get in better shape?
Well, like I said, we were not required to run and march as much as the other groups. So we may have been a little deficient as far as physical training went, but I think we participated in most normal physical training activities. So.
Okay. And then how long did basic last? How long?
2 months.
Okay. And then what did you do next?
I was, when I left Fort Knox, I was put on and I remember this very well, it was a Constellation, the plane with 3 tail fins up, and we flew that from Louisville, Kentucky to Newark Airport, and I distinctly remember the plane circling over the New York metropolitan area. I saw the Empire State Building for the first time in my life. It was an experience. I had flown before, so it wasn't my first flight, but it was memorable because we flew over the New York skyline and landed in Newark.
Okay, and where were they taking you?
To Fort Monmouth, New Jersey.
All right, and then what did you do there?
There I received my training as a microwave radio repairman. Basically, they start you out teaching you basic electronics, and that goes on for several weeks. Once you get the basic electronics, then they teach you how to operate the microwave radio gear. It was interesting at that time, the equipment that we trained on was left over from the Korean War. So it was tube type equipment, although the military did have solid state equipment. At the last week or two of training, they introduced us to solid state electronics. So in case we might serve somewhere where that was the equipment that they were using. But that's interesting as well, because the solid state stuff was in other parts of the country. It was also, microwave radio was also used as missile guidance radio equipment. So some of the guys left Monmouth and went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to join up with the, I guess they called them artillery, but they were, artillery was missiles. So they received the same training that we did for that. But the tube type equipment that we worked on in school was primarily used in Vietnam. So if you were being trained on the Amtrak 29, you were going to Vietnam.
Okay. So they were at least teaching you on the equipment you were going to use as opposed to switching you at the last minute.
Correct.
Okay, so it sort of makes sense, and for the Army, I guess that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Now, what was daily life like there?
In Fort Monmouth, it was pretty plain and simple, very much a lot closer to civilian life, very laid back. It wasn't as military as you might expect, although there was a period of time where the individuals that were training to learn about the microwave equipment came from other areas of the military, where career soldiers were changing their MOS, their
Specialization.
specialty to another field, and so there were some career soldiers that were blended in with us. At a point in time, there were a couple of gentlemen from Airborne. They had a whole different idea about how we should do things, and we actually had a little difference of opinion at a point in time. I was one of three guys that dissented. We went through the military chain of command, went and saw the first sergeant, the XO, finally ended up in front of the old man. The airborne fellows felt that our barracks wasn't strack enough, so they wanted a little more spit and polish. We obliged them. They came back, they didn't find our barracks spit and polish enough. They found a few grains of dust here and there, and they pulled our passes for the weekend. And at that point we dissented, and when we got to the old man, the captain that was over our company, he kind of like, what the heck are these guys doing? This is a microwave school, this isn't airborne. So he reinstated our passes, and we didn't see those guys for a couple of weeks, and that was towards the end of our training, so we left.
So the airborne guys, they were just other people who were going through the school, right? They were
Correct.
They were not there as instructors. They didn't have
That's
authority
correct.
over you.
They were basically peers.
Okay.
Even though they were of higher rank, they were buck sergeant and I think an E6 hard stripe sergeant that were basically put in charge of our platoon.
Okay.
And then as platoon leaders, they wanted to set the standard, and didn't fit.
Lovely. Okay. Now, did you get to go off base much?
Yeah, every weekend and evenings. We were quite free. We could wander about. It was there at a bad time of year through the winter. New Jersey is a relatively mild winter climate, so we could get out and about pretty easily. There was times when it did that. Winter of 67, 68, it was kind of snowy, so it was interesting because the military issued everybody a snow shovel, and you went out and cleared the walks and driveways, and just manpower.
Right.
But it worked rather well. It had a nice clean area when it did snow.
Okay.
But
Now, would you go to New York or Philadelphia or?
I was in an odd situation. I had broken my car that I had before I went in the military, and that car had to be paid for. I was making payments on it. Besides the fact that I broke it, which cost a whole lot more to restore it, and then they ended up selling it, and it didn't quite cover what I owed on it. So I spent probably 2/3 of my military career sending most of the money that I made home. So I couldn't venture out too far, but I did have the opportunity to go to New York City once, and that was an experience in itself.
Okay. Now, you're also there, you're getting into 1968. A lot of kind of interesting things are happening politically at that point. You've had, I mean, the Tet Offensive has happened, the Johnson decides not to run, King gets assassinated. Now, were you at Fort Monmouth when those things happened?
Yes, and to that point, the activity that I saw on base, there was a group. Because we were there for training, it didn't involve us, but it involved the people that were permanently assigned to Fort Monmouth. They had a drill on one weekend where they brought in helicopters and loaded the troops onto the helicopters and evacuated them or relocated them so that they were basically drilling and preparing for riots. So we had that experience.
All right. But on the base itself, there wasn't a whole lot of trouble or racial
There,
tension? Or...
no trouble, no demonstrations. I think at one point in time there might have been maybe like 5 or 6 people outside the base with signs, and people just said there's demonstrators out there, and it's like, really?
Okay.
But nothing notable.
All right. So when do you finish up at Fort Monmouth?
In May of '68.
Okay. And what happens to you next?
Went home for a 30-day leave, and then made my trip over to across the pond. At one point, at the end of training, we sat down with an individual that talked to us about where we were going to be assigned. I was asked at the time if there was anybody else in my family that was in the military, and at the time my brother was, and indeed he was serving off the coast of Vietnam in a destroyer with he was a Naval Reserve, spending his time in active duty with the Navy off the coast of Vietnam. So at that point, I really didn't have to go to Vietnam. I was told that, but then I asked when my brother left the coast of Vietnam, how long would it take for me to be assigned to Vietnam? And they said, for your MOS, which is very critical in Vietnam, you would go immediately. So I said, well, let's just go and get it over with. So that's what got me to Vietnam.
All right. Now, what's the process of shipping somebody to Vietnam?
Basically, they make sure that you have all the necessary immunizations and shots that you need. There was a very brief period of training, like a day, that was done at Fort Dix just prior to me shipping out. I think that I don't really remember exactly how that happened, but basically they took you into a room, sat you down, explained a few things. There was some things in basic training that were pointed towards the Vietnam War, the night fighting and different things, but we really didn't do any specific training in basic. That was all to come in your AIT. But like I say, for us being radio men, they put us on the back of a deuce and a half. We drove down a road on the Fort Dix Army base there. They simulated an assault, an ambush, if you will. were told at the beginning that should you run into an ambush, you jump off the other side of the truck and hide in the bushes, and so we were to work our way back to a certain point, and we just walked through the woods and got back to where we were supposed to be, and that was our training. So,
Okay.
excuse me.
All right. And then do they fly you out of Fort Dix, or do you fly civilian
We,
aircraft? Or?
now, when I went over for the first tour, I flew out on civilian aircraft, stopped over and I believe the first time I went, stopped in Hawaii, and then I think it was either Wake Island or Guam to refuel, and then we landed directly into Benoit Air Base.
Okay. All right. And what's your first impression of Vietnam when you get there?
When on the plane, we're talking to each other, and we're wondering, are we going to jump off the plane and run to a foxhole, or what's going to happen? And it was very uneventful. The plane landed. We got out. The Vietnamese civilians were all over outside the airport. Once we landed at the airport, we were transported by bus to the 90th replacement. The bus had wire screening on the windows, so it's like, okay, what's this all about? Well, it's keep them throwing hand grenades in the bus. It's like, oh, okay. But we just, drove down the road, and Vietnamese civilians were all over the place, so it was a little strange. I mean, we always, as growing up, you always heard the World War II stories, the front and stuff, and that didn't exist in Vietnam. That was a different kind of thing. But we went to 90th replacement. It's funny, in a way, that I was there for a couple of days. They knew where I was going to be assigned. The company that I was assigned to, 327 Signal Company, was at Long Binh, and Long Binh's only like 5 miles away from Benoit Air Base, which is where the 90th replacement was. Took them a couple days to come over there and pick us up and take us to the 327 Signal Company and get us acclimated. So.
All right. So you start out then based at Long Binh?
Right.
Okay. And what were you doing there?
Basically, most of the people that I went over there with, the microwave technicians, were brought to the headquarters company there in Long Binh, and then immediately shipped out to a detachment. Personally, I was left there for like 3 months, and basically I pulled details. We went out and got a truckload of dirt to fill sandbags with. There was some sandbag filling. There was some painting, sprucing things up around the company area. I spent one day in a camo bunker. Basically, every hour on the hour, you'd make communication contact. Somebody would call you. You would respond. They would affirm that you were where you were supposed to be and nothing was happening on the base. The idea being, if something did happen, that people would come to that bunker. It was like a command bunker, and at that point in time, they would have set up a command center and stuff. But basically, all we were doing is just keeping a communications web functional.
Okay. So you're really not doing very much of what you were trained for at that point?
Not at all. Not at all. So at that was another thing I thought, gee, what am I doing here? So it took, like I say, about 3 months, and then every morning you'd fall out in a formation. You'd be assigned to do something, and then you might go out with a couple other guys, or maybe a dozen guys, depending upon what the detail was going to do. And it's kind of odd in a way. I never served KP. I could have just as well as anybody else, but the things that they had me do were pretty common, simple stuff. So,
Okay.
and then one day I fell out in formation. First sergeant said, "Stelter, I want to see you in the headquarters office after the formation, and need to talk to you a little bit." So when the formation was dismissed, I went to the first sergeant's office, and he told me that I had been reassigned and I would be transported down to a base called Vinh Long, to replace a soldier that we had lost during a mortar attack.
Okay. Now, during those 3 months when you're at Long Binh, did you spend the whole time on the base, or did you ever go off it?
Always on the base.
All right. Okay. So where is Vinh Long?
Vinh Long is as the Mekong River came into Vietnam, it split into three prongs. Basically, Vinh Long was on the middle prong, and it was on the south bank of the river. And it was part of a radio relay setup for my signal company between Dong Tam. Vinh Long was the relay, and the eventual site that the signal went to was Can Tho. In Can Tho, they did have solid state equipment. They had a piece of equipment they called Track 90, which was tropospheric scatter. It had a huge dish, and they bounced the radio signals off the troposphere and then down to Saigon. So that was the Delta's communication link to Saigon. The Dong Tam, My Tho was the closest Vietnamese village, was the base for the 25th Infantry Division. That base was, the fellows from our outfit that were stationed there were pretty much under very regular mortar attacks. The Vietnamese really didn't like the 25th Infantry Division, and as a result, that base was attacked regularly.
Okay. Now, what was that? Okay, how did they get you down to Vinh Long?
That was another experience. The first day, I grabbed my duffel bag and jumped in a Jeep, and I was taken to a heliport. I went to get on a helicopter, and as we were arriving, the helicopter took off. I got left behind. Went back to the first sergeant, said, "Hey, you told me I was supposed to catch this helicopter, and it left." And he said, "Yeah, I know, I got a phone call, the helicopter was full, and we'll get you down there." And I thought, okay, fine. So the next day, they took me to a nearby base that I left Long Binh and went to a place called Bearcat. And there I got on what they called an Otter, which was a fixed-wing aircraft, extremely slow flying. It was an interesting experience just taking off in it, because it just didn't seem like it got up enough speed, and it took forever. It must have ran the full length of the runway before it got off the ground. And another thing, because it flew so slowly and didn't have a lot of power, they circled Bearcat a couple of times to gain altitude before they flew out over the jungle where they may have been shot at. And I rode that down to Vinh Long and found myself reunited with a buddy from radio school, and then also met a gentleman from up north here in Michigan, Grand Haven. He was very excited to see me, so I thought that was pretty good. But the change from Long Binh to Vinh Long, it was like I was kind of in a somewhat more civilized, clean, organized area. There were actually like 3-bedroom ranch homes that were built in a little development in an area. I'm sure they were occupied by field officers or whatever. But then Vinh Long was kind of a ratty little nasty base. And at that point in time, and I never really had it explained to me or what, but Vinh Long was under attack every night. The first night that I got there, it was like the 4th of July. The whole place was just incoming rounds, outgoing, mortar fire. There weren't any rockets. It was mainly mortars. Huey Cobra gunships were flying around the perimeter, spraying minigun fire into the perimeter. We sat and listened to the radio. There were people crawling into the wires and stuff around the place. It was like they were, trying to overrun the base, and that went on probably for the first couple of weeks. And I tell people I just really don't have a good recollection. I don't recall what went on during that period of time, because it's just all hell broke loose every night. And
So what's the basic time frame for that? When do you get out to Vinh Long?
I'm guessing, and I don't really have a record of it, but like I say, I think I spent 3 months in Long Bend, so that would have been, got out of school in May. June, I was home for a 30-day leave prior to going, so it must have been July, August, September. So late September, early October, I was first arrived there.
All right. Now, and so how long did it stay that intense?
It probably for at least 3 or 4 months, but it was gradually de-escalating. Like I say, the first 2 weeks it was all hell broke loose every night. Then it got to be where it was like every other night. Then it got a couple times a week. Then it got a couple times a month. And by the time I left, which was another decision point in my career with the military, I thought, it's getting pretty quiet around here. Why don't I just go home and come back? I'll spend 8 months and I'll get my 5 month early out and I'll be out of the military. And this isn't so bad. It's getting quiet here. So that was the thing. Now, during Tet, I guess the fighting around Venlong was quite intense. As a matter of fact, the fellas that were there with the 327th Signal Company carried their weapons, served on the guard posts. They were an active part of the fighting. By the time I got there, it's settled. This is quiet. This is settled down. That we were no longer pulling those kind of details. So it got away from that, but the fighting was still, to me, fairly intense.
Sure. And you were replacing somebody who had gotten killed.
Yes.
So, okay. Now, what else was on that base? You have the signal detachment, and then what else?
Well, we were there as a relay site,
Yeah.
okay, but we were also supporting I'm thinking probably a battalion, maybe, of infantrymen. There was an airstrip there that was of interest to the enemy because that was their primary target when they hit us with mortars, was to tear up the airstrip. But that was about it. A small group of military folks.
And then, do you have a sense of what size unit you had for perimeter guard? Did you have a rifle company or a platoon?
Probably something like a company.
Yeah.
The area was expanded by the airstrip. We did protect the airstrip. At some bases, they just protected the living quarters and mess hall and stuff like that. At our base, we were protecting the airstrip as well, so it was a little bigger.
All right. Now, what kind of physical quarters did you have there?
Actually, what we called a hooch was a wood frame building with a corrugated metal roof. And we were told that roof was stout enough to protect us from a direct hit by a mortar. The idea was the mortar would hit the metal roof and it was stiff enough where it would set the mortar off and the shrapnel would go up and out, as mortars were designed to do. So after the fella that I replaced that had been killed left, actually he was killed leaving the hooch to go to a bunker. Had he stayed in the hooch, he would have been fine.
Okay.
So they told us, you stay in the hooch and crawl under your bunker and cover yourself with your flak jacket. So we always had our flak jackets hanging on our bunks, and we just the top guy would roll out first, get under the bunk, the bottom bunk would roll in and pull the flak jackets in. The perimeter of the hooch was surrounded by 55-gallon drums filled with sand. So and they were stacked on one on top of the other, so we really didn't have you couldn't look out a window, you saw a steel drum. But so we were kind of living in a bunker, if you will.
Now, were they right about the roofs being mortar-proof?
We never had the opportunity to find out for sure.
Well, good. Okay. Now, were you still taking casualties in those first weeks when you were there, were people still getting hit? Or?
Yes. And I don't know, how many were killed or injured or what, but there were people that were being medevaced.
Now, do you know if any of the enemy actually managed to get into the perimeter, or were they...
One evening, I recall listening to a PRC 25, basically a field radio. We got one from somewhere, and so we were on the same frequency as the perimeter security group was, and they were communicating back and forth with the command bunker, and they talked about sappers in the wire.
Yep.
And he's in the first wire, he's in the second wire, whatever. So they kept calling back and forth, asking to shoot the guy, and they kept saying, "No, observe, observe." So they wanted to see how far this guy was going to penetrate the compound before they did anything about it. And I don't remember the outcome, but he didn't penetrate the perimeter at that point in time. We were okay. Although south of us, the Vietnamese did the southern end of the relay was Can Tho, which was a larger base, better protected. The Vietnamese pulled a shenanigan down there where they somehow got a hold of one of our ambulances, loaded it with guerrilla fighters, fired up the sirens, came to the base after an attack had started, like, we're here to pick up wounded or whatever. They threw open the gates. These guys drove into the flight line. They got out of the ambulance. They ran down the flight line. They were throwing satchel charges into the revetments where the helicopters and aircraft were parked, blowing up aircraft and stuff. Jumped back in the ambulance, turned around, fired up the sirens, and drove out the main gate.
Wow.
So it was a suicide mission. They didn't expect to get away, but under normal circumstances, I mean, here comes an ambulance. What do you do? Well, open the gate, let them out, take the wounded to the hospital. I didn't realize it was the same ambulance that brought the bad guys in. So there were those type of attacks that took place.
Okay.
Thankfully, not at the base I was at the time.
Right. Now, the enemy that was around you, do you know if they were Viet Cong or North Vietnamese?
From what we were told, basically it was Viet Cong. They were local people. At that point in time, now this is after Tet of '68, Tet kind of extended itself at Vinh Long. The other compounds, like I say, Dong Tam, they were under constant attack all the time. Whatever the Viet Cong or North NVA had, they were throwing it at the 25th Infantry Division. We weren't quite that much of a target, although it took them quite a while to wipe out or cut back the troops that were coming to try and overthrow us. But we didn't have that sophisticated of a group, and they really didn't have the firepower either, because our normal attacks were like 60 and 80 millimeter mortars. There was one event one time where they got a hold of some 120 millimeter mortars. They dropped 3 of them, and they fell within I would say 100 meters of our hooch. It was very loud, and shrapnel. With the other attacks, we never had shrapnel land on the roof or anything. It came down like shovelfuls. So we knew it was very close, and it was a scary situation.
That just happened once. That just happened once.
That happened once, yeah.
Okay. All right. So does, as time kind of goes on, then do things kind of settle into a routine for you there?
Pretty much, yeah. We did our social things. We'd get together, sit around, play cards, drink beer. It kind of varied with our, because we were a detachment, we were so small, we were under a NCO. The officer that was in charge, the next person up in our chain of command was actually stationed in Dongtam, which is another story. But so we had an NCO in charge of us, so we were laid back. One sergeant was a little more adept than another, and he made a deal with the mess hall people and got us some steaks, and we had made some potato salad and drank some beer, and we'd have a little party maybe once a month or something. But that gentleman was only with us for a short period of time, so he made us work hard. We re-sandbagged bunkers and re-fortified our facility and stuff. It was a lot of work to do that, but it kept us busy and gave us something to do, and then we were rewarded with a party. The following sergeant that we had wasn't quite as resourceful, and matter of fact, he was pretty reluctant to even fulfill his military obligation. He was incapacitated a good part of the time.
Okay.
So, another experience.
But you guys basically knew what you were doing and just went about and did your jobs anyway.
Absolutely.
Regardless of that. Okay. Now, did you have any Vietnamese who would come into the compound?
Absolutely, every day.
Okay.
There was a civilian group that came in every morning. Of most of the other, your hooch would have basically a person, I guess, assigned to it. We paid them out of our pockets to do our military things: shine our boots, clean our clothes, press them. So we had stuff, clean the hooch out, sweep it out, make our beds. Just a housekeeper basically. Right. We were a little exceptional. All the other ones had mama sans. We had a papa san. So we had a guy that took care of us, and he was able to help us out pretty well. He had some good contacts. He was an older fella, so he knew where to go to get things and get things done and stuff. So it was kind of interesting.
So by getting things that are on the base or that he can get from off base?
On or off. He knew where to get certain supplies and stuff so that our uniforms were maybe better cared for than others, and he made, you forgot to throw something, in to be washed, and he could get it taken care of in a matter of a couple hours. Little amenities.
Okay. Did you have concerns that any of these people were Viet Cong?
We did not at the time, but over time, we began to learn that we weren't the ones to watch. I mean, that wasn't part of our deal. We just heard about things after the fact. But there were a couple of things that were significant. One, our radio site had a tower, like a scaffold, 147 feet in the air. And that's where our radio dishes were mounted. That tower was the aiming point for the mortar attacks. So there was no way that they were going to destroy our radio site. We had no idea. The other thing was that from time to time, you might see somebody, and they were very discreet about it, but they'd walk by the radio site. Well, while they were walking by it, they were counting their steps to measure the distance from the radio tower to targets around the base. And we were oblivious to that. I mean, but that's something we learned after the fact. So.
Okay. Now, was there any kind of village nearby, or was it just?
We were basically on the south edge of town, and the town was right against the shore of the middle branch of the Mekong River, as I stated earlier, and then we were just south of that with our air base or airstrip. So you could basically walk out the gate. Although we didn't walk, you'd hitch a ride and go into the village. And I did that on several occasions. It wasn't something that we did on a daily routine, but from time to time, and that was an oddity. I mean, here we are in a war zone. You walk off the base, you go into the village and mingle with the natives. And then there was a curfew. You had to be gone and back. I can remember on one occasion, and I did get in a little trouble for it. For some reason, there was a MAC-V, the command group in Vietnam, had a little compound between the base and the village proper. It was a villa, if you will, on the river. So it was kind of a nice setting, and they had a bar there, so we went down to the bar to have a few drinks and spend the evening. Well, in the course of the evening, I had wandered away from the bar, and I mean, there were no fences, there were no, restrictions. I just walked out of the bar and walked down the street into the village. And not, I was oblivious. I didn't realize that there was a problem or anything, and ran into some of the villagers, and they confronted me, and what you do, and I'm out for a walk, and okay, and a few people gathered around me, and just asking, what's going on, and I'm just out for a walk and stuff, and and then I thought, well, I've been here long enough, I guess I better go back to the guys. Well, by the time I turned around and went back, the guys had already left, and they didn't know where the heck I was. So I stayed there for a little bit, and pretty quick, here the guys came back and said, where the heck were you? Where'd you go? I said, well, I just went into the village for a little bit. Oh, you're not supposed to do that. So I got in the Jeep, we went back to the base. We were confronted by the military police at that point in time, because my sergeant and another fellow were confronted, and they said, well, we had a troop, and we were there past curfew, and I didn't even think about a curfew. It was just the way it was there, and it ended up, they wanted to arrest me and everything, and the sergeant was able to talk them out of it, and they took me back to the compound, and don't do that again. So.
All right. Now, in some cases, villages near your bases provided a variety of resources for soldiers, including potentially women or bars or other things. Was that the case there?
That was in town.
Yeah.
You leave the base, go into town, and there was a little bar district, and
was that considered to be dangerous, or you had to be careful what you were doing there? Or?
never any concern. There was one occasion, a guy from the 1st Signal Brigade, a photographer, came down to photograph Signal Corps personnel and what they encountered during the monsoons. So he was taking pictures of us while it was raining. And it stopped raining, and he stopped taking pictures. I said, well, let's go to town and get a beer. So okay, so we hitched a ride, got into town. We were sitting in a bar having a beer, and commotion erupted outside, and the people that owned the bar went over and closed the doors and stuff, and we're sitting there drinking beer, and we didn't think anything of it. Some guy banged on the door. The guy opened the door, and he's yelling, VC in the village. And it's like, yeah, right, and he had, somebody hit him in the head. He had blood on his face and stuff, and I thought, I'm not getting into that. The guy, owner, pushed him out, rebarred the door, and I thought, I'm safe in here, I'm just going to stay. There's some fighting that breaks out, I'm going to be in here, not out in the middle of the street. The commotion escalated, got noisier and stuff, and the owner of the bar came to us and said, you go now, it's time for you to get out of here. So, all right, fine. So me and the guy got up and went out in the street and hitched a ride on a truck, and instead of going to the base, we went further into town, and we found another bar, and we sat down and had another beer. And we kind of left the street stuff and went to the other bar, and then it's like the commotion followed us. So we thought, well, we better get out of here. So we came out of the bar and saw an MP in the street. So we went over to the MP, said, hey, look, we got to get out of here. And he said, we'll get you a ride, and because there were military vehicles passing once, every so often. So we stood by him. Well, while we were standing beside him. Vietnamese, what they call a QC, came up beside him, and he's yelling and pointing at us and speak, in Vietnamese, and I had no idea what he was doing. But in the meantime, he's trying to get a hold of the MP's sidearm. It's like, hey, he's you gotta be a little more than that. He's going, get out of here.
So the QC is a Vietnamese policeman, essentially.
Yes, and they were pointing at us and saying things, and we never really did find out what happened. They just, I think, some GI offended some barkeeper or something, and then some ruckus broke out or whatever. But we got on a deuce and a half and went back to the base, and that was the end of that. But so there were incidents.
Mm-hmm. All right. But a lot of your exposure really to the war part was simply the bombardments of the base, and especially early on. Okay. So now how long did you stay then at Vinh Long before you went home?
I was at Vinh Long until June of 68.
Or 69?
Or I'm sorry, 69 it would be, yeah.
All right. Now, and then you basically extended.
I had extended because it was quiet, and I felt that I could come back. So I went home for 30-day leave in July of 69, and in August returned and served out.
Okay. So what was it like to leave Vietnam for a month?
Actually, that 30 days was, as I think back, it's just pretty much a blur. I came back home. I met with some of my buddies and friends, but a lot of them, they'd gone off into start careers and jobs and different things, and here I am home when they're working, so we didn't have that much time to get together. Of course, I meet some friends at bars and party and carry on a little bit. And I did the 4th of July. I went up to Saugatuck. At that point in time, Saugatuck was kind of a big party on the 4th of July, and there were a lot of hippie types, if you will, and there was some kind of a festival up there then, and I went up there just to see what was going on, and just bikers and different group of people, and it was kind of different.
Okay. Now, could people look at you and know you were in the military, or?
No.
Okay.
I didn't. I mean, my hair was shorter than most people, but I just put on a t-shirt and some Levi's and went on. Nobody really singled me out or anything.
Now, when you were going, like flying in the U.S., did you go in uniform, or did you?
Civilian attire.
Okay. And was that recommended to you when you were coming over?
No. It was a personal choice based on things that I was hearing and seeing at the time, and I guess there was a little, some comments made, when I left that, hey, things aren't completely normal over there. And of course, the only information we got was the one television station we had presented by the military, and the Stars and Stripes newspaper that we got. I think it was like a weekly publication, and they didn't put all of the pictures of the demonstrations and stuff that were going on. A little bit, but they didn't play it up, so I never really thought too much about it. And actually coming home, going through the major airports and stuff, you saw some people, hippie types, if you will, running around, and it's like, nah. I just didn't think too much of it at that point in time.
Yeah. They weren't bothering you any?
No.
Okay. All right. So now you go back again. I get back to Vietnam. Now where do you get assigned?
Okay. When I went back to Vietnam, I had some problems at Vinh Long with the sergeant. As I was saying, he wasn't doing his job, and that kind of upset me and him both. So we were both reassigned. When I got back, at that point, because I was returning, the first sergeant said, "Where do you want to go?" I could go to any one of the bases that we were at, and I found out that a friend was at Canto. I was familiar with their setup because it was in our relay, so I thought, well, I'll just go down there. It was a bigger base, it was nicer, although I found out that it wasn't. I guess that was a something that I didn't really understand. But the in Vin Long, as primitive as it was, we had running water. We could take hot showers there daily. The mess hall, the food was halfway decent. We only got food poisoned a couple of times there. When I went to Canto, it was a bigger facility, a better laid out. Buildings were in better shape and stuff. Did not have hot and cold running water. There was a water heater there, but nobody knew how to operate it. So we just took cold water and dumped it on ourselves out of a slop sink. So it was kind of primitive. The mess halls, the food honestly was so bad that you couldn't eat it a lot of times. It was poorly prepared. The utensils and stuff, the Vietnamese ran our kitchens and stuff, so they didn't wash well or whatever. I was had dysentery most of the 8 months that I was there. We tried to find, there were nearby bases where we were allowed to go to eat. One base we could go to, it cost us $0.10 to have a meal. But there you could get something good that would stay in you. So we kind of did that. Plus on base, there was a Vietnamese concession that made their Egg McMuffin, bacon, egg, and cheese, little sandwiches they'd make for breakfast, or something, make you a hamburger kind of thing for, but I was short on funds while I was there, so I didn't have the money to buy meals, so I just kind of supplemented my eating with that. That's another thing too that's kind of odd. You didn't think about it, but I told you in Vin Long we had parties and we had steak. We didn't have steak at the mess hall. We had steak if the sergeant went and negotiated with the cook. Then we could have steak. I didn't understand. The Army didn't run that right. On my second tour, I had to take some radio parts down to a radio site on Phu Quoc Island, which was 80 miles off the coast of Vietnam. We had a radio site there supporting a CB detachment. They were building an airstrip and securing it. There was also a very large NVA prison camp on that island. So there was always concern that somebody would break loose there. So the CBs were, as well as construction, providing security, and then we provided the communications for them. I went down there and spent a couple of days, and it just shocked me. I went in the mess hall and they were having steak. So I did have steak in one mess hall. But like I say, that I probably weighed 150, 160 pounds most of my time over there. On my second tour, by the time I rotated out, I weighed 125 pounds. I was skin and bones. I just, because of the food and stuff.
Okay.
But
could they treat you medically for the dysentery or give you anything?
didn't bother to ask. Didn't, as a 20-year-old kid, 21-year-old kid, you just don't think about it. I mean, and everybody was doing the same thing, and it's like, this is life. This is the way it is,
So it didn't get to the point where it was debilitating.
No. But just like I say, if I was hungry and felt, then I'd go off base and find a meal someplace else. So.
All right. Now, did you have, before you had left, in the first part, when you were in Vietnam, you had kind of observed that things seemed to be getting kind of quieter over time. Now, did that continue when you were at Canto? Was it relatively quiet?
It was all, in my whole 8 months there was never a mortar attack, never any incoming rounds at Canto. I could have been stateside, and two, we were free to come and go to the village. We had more vehicles that we had access to. We had a Jeep, a deuce and a half, and a 3/4 ton truck. You could jump on any one of them, run into the village, get something to eat, drink, carry on with the natives, come back. It was pretty open, pretty simple.
Okay. Now, were you aware at this point of Nixon's plans of Vietnamization and all this sort of thing?
Good point. Yes, very much so. And actually, the war in the Delta region had started to escalate because we were starting to hear of different outposts where our radio sites were that were starting to come under attack again, because that whole Delta region had pretty well kind of calmed down there towards the end of my first tour,
Right.
and it was pretty quiet when I had returned, and then only, I'm going to say, maybe the last couple of months there was talk. Now, my base didn't get hit, but some of the other bases were starting to get hit as the Vietnamization was taking place. So it was noticeable.
So essentially, as the Americans were kind of pulling out and turning things over to the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong come back. Was that the impression or assumption,
Well,
or did you not really know?
My understanding is that apparently there was more of an effort to bring things down the old Ho Chi Minh Trail and resupply the Viet Cong and kind of get them going again from the North Vietnamese. There was one incident that I heard of, and we were never really sure. We had a civilian contractor from Collins Radio that oversaw our radio equipment, and any major maintenance he was there to perform. We weren't able to do it.
Okay, I'm going to pause you right here because this tape is about up. All right, you were talking about a fellow from Collins Electric.
Collins Radio. Yeah.
Radio, yeah.
Basically, there was an incident. He was at one of our radio sites servicing the radio gear, so he spent a couple days there. It was what place we called Rockjaw, which was down in the southern end of Vietnam. He was socializing with other civilians one evening, and so curfews and things didn't really pertain to him. He carried a sidearm for his personal protection. He was out, like I say, socializing, and on his way back, he wandered the streets of Rockjaw, and for some reason, maybe he had a little too much to drink or what, but he decided to take a break, and he took a seat in front of a building and rested for a moment, and a gentleman came by in black pajamas with a straw hat carrying an AK-47. And the gentleman confronted him and pointed to his sidearm, which was like I think it was a Browning 9mm that he'd had, and a shoulder holster. And he, through sign language, basically was telling this gentleman he wanted to make a trade, his AK-47 for his sidearm. And he wasn't quite sure. I mean, the Viet Cong really didn't have uniforms, but I mean, of course, we always talked about black pajamas and stuff, but that was the clothing that the people wore, were black pajamas. So he denied the guy the swap, and the guy just turned around and walked away. Well, after he left, the civilian gentleman from Collins Radio sat there, and just all of a sudden you could feel the blood draining from his body, like he was ready to pass out. He thought, oh my God, that guy could have been a Viet Cong or what, and shot me and taken my sidearm. But of course he probably didn't want to start a fracas in the area and draw attention to the fact that he was there. So he just left him be, but he may have dodged a bullet, if you will. So.
Okay. Now, in the time that you were there, were there any problems with drug use on the bases?
I don't know that you'd call it a problem. It was prevalent. The hooch, if you will, that I was billeted in Canto, there was a bunker right outside of the room that I slept in, and that seemed to be a favorite spot for the people that smoked marijuana every evening. And it wasn't like there was one or two, there must have been 15, 20 guys up there smoking dope, and the cloud just rolled right through the hooch. There were a couple doors down, there was a couple guys in my outfit had a room, and our officer in charge of our detachment there every night went there and sat and played pinochle and drank scotch while the guys sat on the bunker and smoked. So, if it was a problem, nobody knew about it. I mean,
So you had what could get labeled as recreational use of
basically, yes.
but not things that really interfered with people doing their jobs, as far as you could tell.
Not noticeable. Yeah, there were rumors and stories that different things said. There were in that group of people. Of course, a couple of guys from our outfit were involved with that, and they had told about one individual, and 15, 20 guys did get into harder drugs. And when it came time for him to rotate out, he didn't go straight home. I just told that they sidetracked him and kind of detoxed him before he went back to civilian life. So, but yeah, some guys drank, some guys smoked.
Right. Okay. Now, did you notice any kind of racial tensions in that time out there?
The black guys in the bases that I was stationed at, there weren't that many. There were in one group of guys that I was friendly with, and we hung out. There was a black guy that was part of our group, and I can remember in one instance, we're sitting outside on the sandbags talking, listening to music or something, and a couple of other black guys walked by and they said something to him, and it was their slang or what, and what's the matter? And basically, they're calling me Uncle Tom. So there was racial tension, but where I was at, what I was involved with, we really didn't see that much of it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, I think you had mentioned you wanted to tell a story about somebody that you knew out there. Or
Well, there was an incident when I was in Vin Long, towards the end of my first tour. I was the maintenance man at the radio site. I'd kind of taken things over. If anything went wrong, go get Stelter. He'll fix it. And so I basically kept the gear operating. I had trouble with a piece of equipment. There was a guy in our northern site, Dongtam, that I knew was very well qualified. He was educated at a higher level. He was a microwave radio repairman technician or something. There was an additional description at the end of his title because he actually did detailed maintenance work on equipment. I knew he was there. I knew he had the knowledge. I asked him to come to our site because I was having trouble with this piece of equipment. He agreed to do that. He was supposed to be there the morning of the next day, and he didn't come, didn't show up, and eventually we got a call from the site that they didn't make it. There had been an incident on the road between sites. There were the maintenance man, a driver, and then our officer in charge. Like I said, he was stationed at Dongtam. He decided to accompany them to come down to visit us. I mean, it was nothing going on, but he thought he ought to see the base he's in charge of. So he joined the group. They left the base. They were headed down the road, if you will, to Vin Long. They were detained by the MPs. They were told that the road ahead hadn't been cleared. He would not advise, going. There was some discussion. The officer basically told the MP, we're not a target. We're just a Jeep. So we'll just go on our way. And it's like, well, your call. So they took off. Well, on the way, I understand the story. There was a 2.5 ton truck. They came and were overtaking the 2.5 ton truck. They were beside it, and apparently a command detonated mine was set off. It blew up the deuce and a half, and it took the back corner out of the Jeep. It wounded the driver's right arm. There was the maintenance guy was sitting in the back seat. He was basically blown in two, and the officer was sitting in the passenger seat of the Jeep. He was decapitated. So the next day, or later that day, the engineers brought the Jeep and the remains, rifles, helmets, flak jackets, personal possessions of the people involved in the incident back to our base, and left that there. And I guess that's the one thing that, if you will, still bugs me about the war, is the fact that I had asked them to come.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have come if I hadn't asked. Of course, they put themselves in the situation by going down the road that wasn't cleared, and they knew it. They lost their lives, so that was a little tough.
All right. And now, are there other incidents or particular memories or impressions you have from your time in Vietnam before we bring you back home?
There was another incident. Fellow was about to leave country because there had been incidents with other people in the Signal Corps. We were told that 10 days before you rotate out of country, you will be at headquarters in Long Binh, because that was considered to be a pretty safe place to be.
Right.
This guy that was from the Rockjaw site decided that he knew what the routine was, so he purposefully left his rifle in Rockjaw, left Rockjaw to be in Long Binh 10 days before he was to leave, started the clearing process to clear post, as they put it. When he got to supply, he didn't have his rifle, and he went, "Gee, I forgot my rifle." They said, "Well, that's not something that we can, just have somebody hand to somebody. That's very personal possession. You need to get it." So he agreed to go back to Rockjaw. Well, what we did then is you could get a helicopter ride, a fixed wing aircraft, something, and just fly from base to base.
Right.
And hop around. Well, he decided he had this in mind, that he would drop off at the various 327 Signal Company detachments and visit. He stopped by our detachment in Canto, which we were like the last leg of his trip, on, let's say, for instance, on Wednesday, okay? Spent the night with us. Thursday, he left for Rockjaw. Friday, I left for Rockjaw to take some supplies down there. It was, I don't know, maybe a 40, 50 mile ride. So on the way down, we passed by the airfield, and looking out in the field, and there's people standing out in the rice paddies out there, and the tail of a C-123A cargo plane sticking up out of the rice paddy. I've got a picture of it. And I went on to the base, and I said, "Well, where's this gentleman?" And they said, "Did you see the plane?" And I said, "Yeah, I did." He said, "Well, he was on that plane." So he was like, 2-3 days from leaving country, and the plane just crashed. I mean, it wasn't like it was shot out of the air. There was something mechanical that went wrong. It went into a steep climb. One of the engines crapped out. It rotated nose down into the ground and accordioned into the rice paddy, and he lost his life just days before he was supposed to go home. So that was kind of a tough incident. But
All right. Now, so did you go to the base then with 10 days?
yes,
you go
I
back
did.
to Long Binh? Okay. And so how do you spend those last 10 days?
Sitting around twiddling your thumbs. They really don't, there's no need to pull any details or anything.
Yeah.
The other guys are pulling the details and stuff. You have to go to finance and go to supply and the various places and clear your records, make sure you've turned in everything you're supposed to turn in, weapons, what have you, your gear, and make sure that you don't owe anybody anything, and you clear personnel, and that your records are straight. So I, find out what medals you're due and stuff, campaign ribbons or whatever. All that gets worked out, and then you just basically sit around, visit with the other troops that are there, and make plans for home.
Okay. And then where did you fly out of?
Flew out of Benoit Air Base as I came in. That was the thing. Flew in a commercial air flight back to the world, if you will. That's interesting too. We didn't mention this, but when I returned to Vietnam for my second tour, I left initially from Oakland the first time, and then the second time, because I was east of the Mississippi, I left out of Fort Dix. When I went to Fort Dix, they didn't have a commercial flight available. I ended up on a Air Force Super Strato C-141, I think it was, cargo plane.
Right.
With jump seats, and here I am going on my return trip to Vietnam on a cargo plane. It was an adventurous trip. You sat with your knees interlocked. You had to crawl over each other. They put a big container on the plane. One side of the container was the restroom. The other side was your meals. So it was an adventure.
All right. And then once you take off on the way home, I mean, is there any kind of celebration as you get out of Vietnamese airspace?
Everybody on the plane yells hurrah and stuff, and where there's a lot of excitement and feel good kind of atmosphere. And too, at the same time, most of the people on the flight are also going to be discharged from the service when they arrived in Oakland. So there was some excitement about that. It happened to be April 1st, and then part of the discharge process, we were in a large room. A person came to the podium explaining the procedures that we were going to follow, and he said, "Oh, by the way, we're not going to discharge any more people today. This is it. We're done." And he starts to turn and walks away from the podium, and then he does an about face and comes back. "All right, April Fool." It's like, yeah, that's not a good joke, But then we continued with the discharge process and got out of there.
Okay. So you're out of the Army now at this point. Did they
Right.
discharge? Yeah.
You're in dress. When we left, I was in a khaki. No, I was in jungle fatigues. And then when you arrive at Oakland, then they issue you a Class A uniform, so you're discharged in a dress uniform. I got that uniform when I left the base. I got a cab, went to a hotel, and the first thing I did is put civilian attire on. There were plenty of stories floating around about the possibility of being confronted by protesters, what have you, people being spit upon, stuff like that. I didn't want to have anything to do with any of that. I just get the military stuff off. I'd kind of let my hair grow out a little bit, and that something like that, and just put civilian attire on and went to the airport in Oakland, and actually I was flew home with a friend to his home in Washington, and then made it back to Michigan from there. So,
All right.
but that was the idea: get rid of the military stuff immediately. I don't have anything to do with this.
Okay. Now you get back home, April 1970. Now what do you do?
Basically, went back to work. Went back to the same company that I worked at. I mean, I'd been short on money all this time. Wanted to get a car. Of course, lived at home initially. It was just to try and work my way back into the civilian life. I ended up going to college, which was kind of an extension of my being a microwave radio repairman. The people that were involved in that training, a lot of those guys were drafted initially and then decided to enlist because they could go to radio school. A lot of them had, some college level education. So that was the talk of the day. Everybody said, what are you going to do when you get back? Well, go to college. Well, there was a delay. I got a job in a factory making record players again, and went to school, and basically that was another thing that kind of helped me get back into things. There were a lot of other Vietnam vets that were going to the Lake Michigan Community College here. We formed a little social group, and we kind of had each other to lean on, if you will, and we better understood each other than some little high school kid. It was just total different experience. So,
yeah. And then did you have kind of trouble transitioning back to being a civilian?
I didn't think so, but talk to my wife. That was there was problems.
Now, were you married when you were in Vietnam, or did you get married afterward?
I married when I got home. I got home in '70 and got married in '72. I met my wife in '70, so her and I were dating.
Okay.
Within, I'm going to say, a few months of my arrival back here. So she kind of helped me get back to some degree of normalcy. So.
And then what kind of career did you go into?
I actually went to LMC and transferred to Western Michigan University and ended up with a degree in industrial engineering, and worked in manufacturing for probably 35 years. So.
All right. Now, if you look back on the time that you spent in the service, how do you think that affected you, or what did you take out of it?
It's interesting. I'm finding out now, here 50 years later, that it affected me more than I thought. But it was kind of a struggle. The whole thing, getting back, and then how I lived my life and how I behaved was kind of set up by some of my pretty much my military experiences. It kind of turned me into a certain type of person or what, and I kind of worked through it. I thought I did a pretty good job.
Okay. Were there positives that you took out of it?
Well, the reason I went in was to get the training to become, get into electronics. My initial attempt in college, my thought was I was going to be an electrical engineer. I ran into an electrical engineer at LMC, and after discussing with him what an electrical engineer's career was like, I decided to become an industrial engineer. So it probably the like I said, the people that were in microwave radio training, they were higher level people than the other folks in the Army. I mean, we had some folks that tried to become microwave radio repairmen, but they just didn't have the necessary skills and abilities to carry through the training, and so they kind of washed out. So it was a different group of people that were microwave radio repairmen. I'll say that.
All right. Well, the whole thing makes for a pretty good story, so thanks for taking the time to share it today.
Certainly.